Well, this might be the easiest introduction in history. Let me just say a couple of words, and sounds like most of you are already very familiar with Amy and her extraordinary work in independent media over the past several years. As you know, she's an award-winning investigative journalist, a syndicated columnist, author, and host of Democracy Now!, which airs in over 1,000 stations, public TV and radio stations worldwide. Locally, she airs on KBCS, which is 91.3 FM. And she's on 3 times a day on that station, and she also airs on AM 1090 Air America on the weekends. Now, I'm going to say a couple of things now because you're familiar with her, but there's a KCTS Public Radio is thinking of putting having Amy air on their station. And so I want you to get your pens out and write this down as a must-do. I want everybody here to contact KCTS and let them know that you want Amy on their station on a regular basis. And the other thing is that the Seattle Times, it appears, has dropped her syndicated column. So, second thing to write down is that you need to contact the Seattle Times and demand that they put back her syndicated column. And I think that they will respond to this. Amongst her books, she will have a book signing after the program, which will be in the lobby, and that will be her book, Breaking the Sound Barrier. She also has 3 other books which she's co-authored with her brother David Goodman, Standing Up to the Madness, Static, and Exception to the Rulers. Her presence here tonight, I think, is evidence of her dedication to the people's movement and not just to being an isolated journalist in the media. And I hope that this event is not just a series of talks, but is actually going to be a call to action. And I'll talk more about that in my final remarks. So anyway, let's give a big hand for Amy, who's going to talk about what we need to do now.
It's really wonderful to be here. To be here with all of you. To be especially here with Quentin Young and his remarkable career of activism, fighting for all of us. And to be back in Washington State and Seattle. I was here in November of 2009. It was right around Thanksgiving. And my last book had just come out. It's the book of columns that used to appear in the Seattle Times. And I hope, I mean, they've always been great supporters, and I really do hope that they'll have us back in the newspaper. And I write the columns with Dennis Moynihan, and since the book had just come out, we were here, I was speaking, we did a big event, believe it or not, at SeaTac. It was Thanksgiving time at the airport. As people were running back and forth, it was a great chance to meet people and talk to people about ideas and where they were going. I met one nurse from Bellingham who was a nurse in the Vietnam War. And for the first time in decades, she was returning to see what had happened in Vietnam. I met a farmer who was fighting genetically modified crops, and it was really a remarkable time. It was also the time that Sarah Palin's book had come out, remember? Going Rogue. And so my book was on one side of the bookstore, and her book was on the other, and a book website was calling up to see who was winning in terms of selling books. And people were coming through, and I was signing books, and finally they called, and I said, we've sold, I don't know how many books at that moment. We'd been there for about an hour, and I said, I think it's 25-0 right now. I said, Going Rogue is going nowhere. Whereupon we then headed up to Canada. Since people were celebrating Thanksgiving in this country, we thought we would go to Canada, where they weren't eating turkey to talk turkey. And I was going to give a speech at the Vancouver Public Library to support the community radio stations there. It was a big fundraiser. And speaking of community radio, I hope all of you support KBCS. It is such an important station, and they're really hitting a milestone right now because they are able to reach 1 million more listeners if they elevate their transmitter and put it on top of a mountain. It's now at next to the station in a parking lot, and they need $160,000 to do this. They've raised over $100,000, and so soon, even in Seattle, you'll be able to hear them. They'll have a stronger signal, and I hope you all support KBCS. They're going into fundraising next week because community radio, Pacifica Radio, independent media, public radio, and public television are where it's at. I think the media are the most powerful institutions on earth, can be the greatest force for peace on earth when they're not being used to beat the drums for war. And independent media, not brought to you by the weapons manufacturers, by the oil, gas, and coal companies, not brought to you by big pharma and the insurance industry, has the greatest possibility to provide a forum for authentic discussion and debate that will lead to the most just society we can achieve in this country. So we were headed to Canada, and I just met some folks from Spain who live in Vancouver who came down for this event tonight. Well, we were headed up there, and we came to the border. We were just driving up. It was raining hard, and they took our passports and they flagged us over and said we had to go into the customs, into the big border facility there. We walked in and they called me up to the counter and they said, we want your notes on what you're going to be talking about tonight. And I said, you're kidding. I said, we already gave you our passports. They said, I want your notes. The customs officer said, fully armed, I want your notes. So this is the thing. I don't really speak from notes. And I said, just 1 minute, please. So I ran out to the car and I got the book. And I brought it in and I gave them a copy. And one of them was typing in a computer. Another of the customs agents started to read the book, which I thought was a good thing. And they said, what are you talking about tonight? I said, well, this is the thing. I sort of riff from columns in the book. And you really could come to the talk tonight because it's an open talk. I wasn't planning to give it on the border, but he said, I need to know what you're talking about. So I said, well, I thought I would start with the last column in the book. It says, imagine the scene. America, 2009. 45,000 people have died in a year, an average of almost more than 120 a day. Who's taking them out? What's killing them? To investigate, President Obama might be tempted to call on Jack Bauer, the fictional rogue intelligence agent from the hit TV series 24, who invariably employs torture and a host of other illegal tactics to help the president fight terrorism. But terrorism is not the culprit here. It's lack of adequate health care. So maybe the president's solution isn't Jack Bauer, but rather the actor who plays him. The star of 24 is played by Kiefer Sutherland, whose family has very deep connections to healthcare reform in Canada. Sutherland is the grandson of the late Tommy Douglas. I just told Congressman McDermott this. He wasn't aware, and he just told you the story of Tommy Douglas, the pioneering Canadian politician credited with creating the modern Canadian healthcare system. As a youth, Tommy Douglas almost lost his ailing leg. His family could not afford treatment, but a doctor treated him for free, provided his medical students could observe. As an adult, Douglas saw the impact of widespread poverty caused by the Great Depression. Trained as a minister, he had a popular oratorical style. He moved into politics, joining the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation Party. After several years in Parliament, he led the party's decisive victory in the province of Saskatchewan, ushering in the first social democratic government in North America. Douglas became Premier of Saskatchewan and pioneered a number of progressive policies, but his biggest battle, for which he is best remembered, is the creation of universal health insurance called Medicare. It passed in Saskatchewan in 1962, guaranteeing hospital care for all residents. Doctors there staged a 23-day strike supported by the US-based American Medical Association. Despite industry opposition, the Saskatchewan Medicare program was so successful and popular it was adopted throughout Canada. While Tommy Douglas was fighting for health insurance in Canada, a similar battle was raging in the US, resulting in the passage of Medicare and Medicaid, giving guaranteed single-payer health care to senior citizens and the poor. I didn't plan to read the book to the border agents, but they were waiting for more. So I talked about someone who's again gotten attention, especially in these last few days, Rush Limbaugh. Rush Limbaugh, Fox News Channel's Glenn Beck, and insurance industry-funded groups have encouraged people to disrupt town hall meetings. This was leading up to with members of Congress, a number of confrontations you might remember around the country. This was in 2011. Rush Limbaugh said 24 was one of his favorite shows. He even visited the set. Well, he should learn from the real-life actor who plays his hero, Jack. Limbaugh and his cohorts might find truth not as satisfying as fiction. In 2004, a Canadian Broadcasting Corporation poll named Tommy Douglas the greatest Canadian. At a protest in 2000 against efforts to roll back the Medicare system in the province of Alberta, Kiefer Sutherland defended Canada's public single-payer system. He said private health care does not work. America's trying to change their system. It's too expensive to get comprehensive medical care in the US. Why on earth are we going to follow their system here? Kiefer Sutherland went on to say, I consider it a humanitarian issue. This is an issue about what is right and wrong, what is decent and what is not. Maybe Jack Bauer can save the day. And the Canadian Border Guard said, what else are you going to talk about tonight? So I said, you know, you're stopping me at the border, you're detaining me, and I've come to applaud your healthcare system. Sarah Palin has been trashing it. Why did you let her just come freely? What else are you talking about? Okay, I was going to talk about poverty. What else? And then I thought maybe this is what he's getting at. I was going to talk about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. What else are you talking about, he said. I said I was going to talk about, you know, the economic crisis. He said, what else? I said, it's not that long a talk. That pretty much covers it. And he says, are you denying right here, right now, that you're going to be talking, that you're not going to talk about the Vancouver Olympics? About the Olympics, he said, not the Vancouver Olympics. And I thought he meant President Obama. Well, I said to him, you mean President Obama going to Copenhagen to try to get the Olympics in Chicago? And he said, and you didn't get them. I said, I know we didn't get them. And I said, are you talking about the, and he said, you know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the Vancouver Olympics. This was right before the Vancouver Olympics. I actually didn't even know the Olympics were going to be taking place in Vancouver, which was even more insulting and made him think that I was not telling the truth. And I said, well, I wasn't planning to talk about them until now. So they went out to our car. I was traveling with two Democracy Now! Folks, and they went through everything in our car, combing through our notes. When I went out to check on them, they had our computers open, and they were going through the computers. They told me to get back inside. When they came back in, they took me into a back room. They took photographs of me and of my colleagues, and then they stamped what they called travel documents in our passports that said we had to leave Canada within 48 hours. So we headed to the Vancouver Public Library. We were about an hour late to the talk, but thank God for Canadians. They went out for beer and they came back double the size of the audience, telling their friends to come as well. And I talked mainly about the Vancouver Olympics, something I had not or asking them what was so significant. And then we headed to the University of Victoria, where I had been invited to speak the next night, and we're staying at a bed and breakfast. And I got there right around 6 o'clock when their news was showing at night, right before the talk. And I walked in, and everyone in the bed and breakfast was having tea before dinner. And so I took a little teacup and some tea, and they turned on the news, and the top story was me getting detained at the border. And everyone turned and looked and said, is that you? And they had made this an issue. And I learned from in following stories after the report of detaining a US journalist, and that was that as the Vancouver Olympics were about to begin, they'd passed legislation that athletes were not allowed to criticize the corporations that were sponsoring the Olympics. You couldn't have a sign in your house against the Olympics, or they could enter the house. There was a real crackdown on free speech. And so when we came back to New York the next day, over the weekend, we devoted our broadcast to the Vancouver Olympics. Now, never let it be said that the state determines what we do. But this kind of crackdown on speech on behalf of corporations is of grave concern, and we're seeing it more and more. But I mentioned Rush Limbaugh, and it is so important to talk about what is happening today. You may have heard in the last few days what happened. Well, it started a few weeks ago when there was a congressional hearing where they were going to be talking about birth control. And the hearing did not have one woman on the panel. My congressman, one of our congress members in New York, Carolyn Maloney, was so enraged. She was on this committee. She said, here we are talking about birth control. She said, where are the women? I don't see a single woman representing the tens of millions of women across this country who want and need insurance coverage. And women Congress members walked out of the hearing. There had been a woman who was supposed to testify. She was 30 years old. She's a law student at Georgetown, a Jesuit university in Washington, D.C. Her name is Sandra Fluck, and her name is becoming a household word because she was prevented from testifying. She came on Democracy Now! It was the first national radio she did, the next show she did the next morning. And she talked about what she had planned to testify about there, about how important it was for women to be able to have access to preventative medicine, and that is birth control. She was representing many women at Georgetown, and she was talking about one in particular who was 27 years old, a friend of hers, who suffered from polycystic ovarian syndrome. And the reason she needed the pill was to control this syndrome. And because she wasn't able to get access to it, she had to have an ovary removed and then went into premature menopause. It is not only used for contraception, though she was speaking out for women having access to birth control as contraception as well, and said we have that right. As a result of her daring to speak out, whether you agree with her or not, and saying that Catholic institutions, Catholic universities, and Catholic hospitals, where most of the staff are not Catholic, should have to provide insurance. Insurance companies should provide for birth control just as they do for any other institution. Even though most people who work for those institutions, millions of them, by the way, this isn't a requirement of parishes, but this is a requirement of universities and hospitals. Even though most of the people who work there are not Catholic, 98% of Catholic women have used birth control. So this is really for everyone. As a result of what she attempted to say, Rush Limbaugh has made her the target of his venom and wrath. And you may have heard what he said over the last few days, calling her a slut and a prostitute, this young woman who wanted to testify before Congress, calling her a slut and a prostitute, saying that, and asking the question, why should the American taxpayer have to pay for every one of her sex acts? And he said, if we do have to, she should have to post videos of having sex on the internet. As a result, President Obama called Sandra Fluck to congratulate her for being so brave and speaking out, and told her to tell her parents that they should be very proud of her. To which Rush Limbaugh responded, he hasn't backed off, he has just become more fierce every day. You are telling a 30-year-old woman that she should tell her parents to be proud. Last night, O'Reilly went on the air to support Rush Limbaugh. Now, what has happened over these last few days has also been amazing. The reaction of people across the political spectrum, pro-choice, anti-choice, whatever your view is, but the kind of insults that have been hurled at this young woman. And so people have organized a boycott, putting pressure on his advertisers in the same way that they put pressure on Don Imus after Don Imus insulted the Rutgers University basketball team, the women's basketball team, which forced him off the air. This boycott of Rush Limbaugh has been extremely successful in just a matter of hours. And so now I hear that someone just said, started to pull out one by one.
After he pulled out, then he apologized.
So this is news to me today. So after this this is happening so fast. I think he has been shocked, and money talks. And so what will happen to him, we will see. But all I could think is when we're talking about issues of single payer or just health care for everyone in this country, you never know when the magic moment will come. I mean, you have people like Dr. Quentin Young and PNHP and advocates for decades who've been working on a kind of Medicare for all system in this country. You never know what will be the tipping point. But if you're involved with activism on any issue, you will be a part of making history when that moment comes. And it's often a moment you cannot predict. And I think this moment of this young woman speaking out could be one of them, because it infuriated so many people in all the different parties, and there are more than two, and more than two can really make a difference in this country. People of every political persuasion and of every generation who were just horrified at the insults that were being hurled. You know, it makes me think of Rosa Parks. And I think it's very instructive to go back to this moment. You've heard some incredibly good speeches today on the healthcare system. They are the experts. I mean, Teresa and Dr. Quentin Young and Jim and all the folks who are speaking to you tonight. And I'm not an expert on healthcare. But covering movements, I think it's very important to see how strategy works. I mean, Rosa Parks, the story that is not told about her, you know, when she died a few years ago, Democracy Now! Raced down to Washington to cover the big memorial service for her before she was buried, the big funeral in Detroit. And when the media told her story again, they said that she was a tired seamstress. She was no troublemaker. But that was not true. Rosa Parks was a first-class troublemaker. I don't know if we can call Quentin Young the Rosa Parks of the healthcare movement, but Rosa Parks knew exactly what she was doing on December 1st, 1955. When she sat down in the bus in Montgomery, Alabama, and she refused to get up when a bus driver told her to get up for a white passenger. You know, she was the secretary of the local NAACP. She worked under E.D. Nixon, who was the president, and he had worked with one of the greatest organizers of the 20th century, with A. Philip Randolph, as they organized the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. Very relevant in Washington state, because the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters were the African-American porters in the Pullman trains, named, Pullman, named for George Pullman. You have Pullman, Washington. And the conductors were all called George. It's not that their mothers had all named them George, but that's what they were called, to give you a sense of just that level of racism, not to mention what they were subjected to. But they brought in A. Philip Randolph to organize them. And then A. Philip Randolph went on to organize the 1963 March on Washington, where Dr. King gave his famous I Have a Dream speech. And E.D. Nixon worked with him. He came out of radical labor politics, and he worked with Rosa Parks as they tried to most effectively challenge the racist laws of the South. She had trained at the Highlander Center, where Dr. King had been also, white and black together, as they most strategically worked to, it wasn't just enough to say we're against this, and they wanted to figure out how to accomplish the challenging of, for example, the laws integrating the transportation system. And so when she sat down on that bus, she knew just what she was doing. Now, she had sat down on the bus before and refused to get up for a white passenger. In fact, other young women had done the same. But you never know when that magic moment will come. But if you're working for social change, you will be a part of determining the future. 4 days later, on December 5th, 1955, after she sat down and got arrested, she was in court, and the Montgomery Improvement Association had their meeting to elect a leader to lead the bus boycott that would lead to the integration of the transportation system of this country. And they elected a young minister who had just come into town, Dr. Martin Luther King. Rosa Parks had helped to launched the modern-day civil rights movement and helped launch Dr. Martin Luther King into the public eye, into what we all know happened after that. It is amazing what she accomplished. And to show how brave she was, just go back a few months to the summer of 1955. That was the summer of Emmett Till. That was the summer that this 14-year-old African-American boy who lived in Chicago with his mother, Mamie, she sent him to Money, Mississippi to be with relatives for the summer to get out of the city. And he was at home sleeping with his aunt and uncle and cousins when a white mob came into the house. They ripped him out of bed. They tortured him. They beat him. And he ended up in the bottom of the Tallahatchie River. They said he wolf whistled at a white woman. When his body was dredged up and sent back to Chicago, his mother, Mamie, did something incredibly courageous. She said she wanted the casket open for the wake and the funeral. She wanted the world to see the ravages of racism, the brutality of bigotry. Thousands walked by his casket and saw his distended, mutilated head. And then Jet magazine and other black publications took photographs, and they were published, and they were seared into the history and consciousness of this country. Mamie Till had a real lesson to teach the press of today. Show the pictures, show the images. And that's what we need the press to do. When we talk about issues that are of concern to everyone, like the national debt, we just had David K. Johnston, the two-time Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times reporter, now works for Reuters, on talking about Mitt Romney's tax plan. There is a connection here. Mitt Romney's tax plan, saying, the tax plan he's put forward would increase taxes on the poorest 125 million Americans, but decrease the taxes for the 0.1% at the top by something like, more than $460,000 a year. And he was talking all about this and about Mitt Romney's offshore, accounts in the Cayman Islands, not only his own personal ones, but also Bain. And he ended up the discussion, though, by saying, if we are concerned about the national debt in this country, the number one issue that we have got to deal with is health care. Simple as that, he said, is health care. And that is something that Republicans and Democrats can unite on. If the media actually shows this and tells us the stories of people all across this country, like Michael in the audience who just came up to me, 25 years old, where are you, who is dealing, there you are, he's waving his hand, has a cast on his arm, doesn't have insurance, dealing with second stage cancer, hoping to conquer it so that he can go on to get his PhD in political science at Santa Cruz, and we all wish you the very best. But showing those stories, telling those stories every single day. I've always believed if the media puts these stories front and center, the stories of people, fighting for health care, like you might have heard our story just a few weeks ago with Elizabeth Benjamin, who's vice president of the Community Service Society in New York, and Hope Rubel, who, how did the Times describe Hope? They didn't say that she was a Democracy Now! Viewer, but she is. But they said, Nina Bernstein wrote a very good piece. This is about New York, but I think it could be about all of the United States. For most of her life, Hope Rubel was a healthy woman with good medical insurance, an unblemished credit history, and a solid career in graphic design. But on the day an ambulance rushed her to a Manhattan hospital emergency room shortly after her 48th birthday, she was jobless, uninsured, and having a stroke. Ms. Rubel's medical problem was rare, a result of a benign tumor on her adrenal gland, but the financial consequences were not unusual. She depleted her savings to pay $17,000 for surgery to remove the tumor and then watched, emotionally paralyzed, she said, as $88,000 in additional hospital bills poured in. Eventually, the hospital sued her for the money. Yet that year, the hospital, New York Presbyterian, Weill Cornell, had already collected $50.2 million from New York State's so-called indigent care pool to help care for people like Ms. Rubel, who have no insurance and cannot pay their bills. This is New York's story. New York's charity care system, partly financed by a 8.95% surcharge on hospital bills, is one of the most complicated in the nation. Like New York, several passed laws curbing hospitals' pursuit of unpaid bills, including Illinois, California, and Minnesota. But this new study by Elizabeth Benjamin at the Community Service Society, who we had on with Hope, a study of New York's hospitals' practices and state records finds that most medical centers are violating the rules without consequences, even as the state government ignores glaring problems in the hospital's own reports. The hospitals have gotten something like $460 million to pay for people like Hope. You know, if you go into the hospital and you're brought into a hospital, sometimes you're not conscious, you're not deciding what hospital you're brought into. You're uninsured. The hospital then, duns you for money, tries to get money from you. You say, I don't know what to do. In 2/3 of the hospitals in New York State, they don't tell you that they have this indigent care program. They don't tell you, they don't give you a financial form that says lay out what your finances are, because overall the system, they get something like $1.2 billion from the state. But they don't tell you this. Sometimes they put your debt into collections. They give it over to a state collector. They sell your debt. And then they get money for this. And then that gets you a lien on your home, for example, if you own a home. Here you are at your sickest, and you are now destitute, that you have a lien on your house. This is a system that I deeply believe Americans across the political spectrum would not stand for if they understood what their neighbors, and so often they themselves, are going through, how often this happens in this country. And it's our job in the media and your job as media consumers to demand that these stories get told every single day. I put this war on not only the poor, because we are talking, in Colorado, 60% of the state's uninsured have jobs. 60% of the state's uninsured have jobs. We are talking not only about the media dealing with life and death issues of the wars abroad, which we must look at, but the war at home. I've always said that if for 1 week all of us and all of the media we run and consume, right, people have their own Facebook pages, we read the newspaper, we go online. If on every Facebook wall, if on the front page of every surviving newspaper in this country, we showed the images of war, like in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? The babies dead on the ground, the soldiers dead and dying, the women with their legs blown off in drone attacks. For just 1 week, if it was the top of every TV and radio newscast, every tweet that you sent out dealt with war in one of these stories. I think Americans are a compassionate people. They would say, no, war is not the answer to conflict in the 21st century. I also think